So picture this. It's the early 15th century, and the greatest naval fleet the world has ever seen is just patrolling the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, and this is decades before Columbus even crossed the Atlantic.
Right, decades before Columbus. And these ships were basically massive floating cities. I mean, carrying thousands of sailors, diplomats, and just tons of cargo. And the craziest part, the admiral commanding this entire unparalleled armada was a Chinese Muslim eunuch named Zheng He.
Which is, I mean, it's a detail that totally shatters the mental image most of us have of the early Islamic world, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If you're hearing this and your mind is a little blown, you aren't alone. And that's exactly what we're getting into in today's deep dive.
Yeah, it really challenges that conventional, heavily Middle Eastern-focused narrative that most of us are taught in school.
Yeah.
Today, we're looking at a text by historians David O. Morgan and Anthony Reid from the New Cambridge History of Islam.
Which is a fantastic source.
It really is. And their central mission here is to dismantle this very persistent, very limiting myth about how this religion actually evolved.
The myth being basically that Islamic history peaked in its first few centuries with those glorious Arab caliphates, right? And then after the 11th century, it just plunged into this depressing thousand-year tailspin.
Exactly, the classic narrative of decline.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to me, the traditional way we teach this history is it's like watching the first season of a massive hit television show, you know, where everything is tightly written around a single cast of characters in one location.
Right, the early caliphates.
Yeah, season 1 is neat. You have a unified Arab empire, you have caliphs ruling from Damascus and Baghdad and this explosive initial expansion, but then you just ignore the sprawling, epic spin-offs that take place all over the globe. Because once that centralized political unity inevitably fractures, the traditional textbook basically just closes.
It does. And closing the book there, you miss the most dynamic part of the entire story.
Yeah.
I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture, by the 11th century, real power had shifted entirely.
Away from Baghdad.
Well, it passed from the titular caliphs, who, they remained in Baghdad, but they functioned more as spiritual figureheads, just stamping royal decrees. Power shifted to this huge multiplicity of regional sultans, emirs, and maliks.
Right.
And this political disunity. It wasn't failure of the system. It was actually geographic necessity.
Because, I mean, an empire can only grow so large before the center just can't hold the periphery anymore.
Precisely. By this era, the Islamic world stretched uninterruptedly from Spain all the way to Central Asia and northern India.
Which is just a staggering amount of land.
It's massive. And over the following centuries, it was destined to spread even further, deep into Western China, coastal South Asia, the Indonesian archipelago. I mean, an expanse that huge, crossing so many radically diverse cultural and linguistic boundaries, it fundamentally defies central rule.
You literally couldn't govern it from one place.
Exactly. It would have been impossible for Islam to transform into a truly global faith if it had just remained a single, politically unified empire governed from one city in Iraq.
Okay, so if Baghdad is losing its administrative grip, something else has to step into that massive power vacuum in the Middle East. And I would assume local Arab governors just started carving out their own fiefdoms.
Some did, sure. But the major catalyst of change actually came from outside the Arab heartlands entirely. It came from the tribal peoples of the Central Asian steppes, particularly the Turks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now, to be clear, the Islamic lands had integrated Turkish people for centuries before this point. The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad had actively imported individual Turkish slaves. These were known as Mamluks or Ghulams.
Right, to serve as elite soldiers, which honestly is a brilliant, albeit super cynical political strategy.
It really was.
Because if you bring in enslaved foreigners as individuals, they have no local family ties, right? And no tribal loyalties left over from the steppes.
Exactly.
So you build this highly trained military force whose survival and status depend entirely on their loyalty to the caliph.
That was the theory, yes. And it worked for a while as a counterbalance against rebellious local armies. But starting in the 11th century, the nature of this Turkish presence changed entirely.
How so?
We stopped seeing individual Mamluks being imported as property. Instead, we begin seeing entire tribal hordes crossing the borders en masse. Groups like the Seljuks, they were migrating with their social structures completely intact. Their nomadic, pastoral way of life was preserved, and their tribal leaders were still very much in charge.
See, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the difference between those two scenarios is massive.
Oh, completely.
It's like the early caliphs purchasing Mamluks, that's like a wealthy homeowner hiring a few foreign mercenaries to guard the estate. But the Seljuk migration, that's like an entire armed nation migrating into your living room, keeping all their weapons, pitching tents on the carpet, and just declaring themselves the new landlords.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize that demographic shock. I mean, these tribal incursions completely rewired the ethnic and political makeup of the Middle East.
Really, just completely rewired it.
Yeah. Consider this detail from the text. Apart from a brief interlude in the 18th century, Iran as a whole has no ethnically Persian rulers from the arrival of the Seljuks in the 11th century all the way until 1925.
Wait, really? Until 1925?
1925.
Yeah.
That is nearly 9 centuries of political power held by Turks or the descendants of Turks.
That is wild. But I have to push back on the mechanics of that, though, because if these were tribally organized nomads, people whose entire societal structure was built around roaming the steppes, herding livestock, hunting, how on earth did they run a complex, sedentary, tax-collecting empire once they actually conquered the cities?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because I imagine their leadership structure wasn't exactly built for, like, urban administration.
It wasn't at all. And that became a severe headache for their own leaders. In steppe culture, a tribal Khan commanded absolute authority during warfare. But he didn't possess despotic, autocratic powers in peacetime. Decisions were often collective.
Okay, so it was more egalitarian.
Right. But once the Seljuk leaders transformed into powerful Muslim sultans ruling over these ancient cities, their own tribal hordes became a total administrative nightmare. The nomads were inherently disorderly. They wanted pasture land for their flocks. They didn't want to be subjects of a centralized state paying taxes.
So the very army that put the Seljuk Sultan on the throne suddenly becomes his biggest liability.
Exactly. To the point where Nizam al-Mulk, he was the great Persian vizier who served the Seljuks, he actually wrote a famous handbook of government recommending a return to the old ways.
You mean going back to the slave soldiers?
Yes. He actively advised the Seljuk sultans to start purchasing those Mamluk slave soldiers again. He was so terrified of the ungovernability of the Turkish tribes that he wanted a standing professional army just to protect the state from the very people who had founded it.
That is such a huge irony. We should probably dissect why these nomads were so impossible to defeat in the first place, too. Because they didn't just conquer the Middle East. I mean, they dominated the battlefields of Eurasia for centuries.
They did. And it really comes down to this lethal combination of lifestyle and technology.
Right.
The nomadic lifestyle meant that every able-bodied male was effectively a permanently available, highly trained cavalryman. They learned to ride and shoot from childhood.
Whereas in an agricultural society...
Exactly. No sedentary society where most men had to stay tied to the land to grow food could ever mobilize such a massive proportion of its population for war.
And their primary tool was the composite bow, right?
Yeah.
The text dives into the physics of this weapon, and it's honestly fascinating.
It's an incredible piece of engineering.
Yeah, because unlike a simple wooden bow, a composite bow is made of horn, wood, and sinew, all laminated together. And this construction creates immense tension. It allowed a horseman to fire arrows with staggering accuracy, a rapid rate of fire, and enough kinetic energy to literally pierce armor from a significant distance.
Which is terrifying if you're an infantryman.
Right. The authors note that the composite bow basically had no equal until long, long after the invention of early firearms. An early musket was practically a downgrade in everything except the noise it made.
Which perfectly explains how they reshaped the map so quickly.
Yeah.
And, the Seljuks entered the Middle East as converts to Islam. The steppe produced a much more traumatic shock a bit later on.
Ah, the Mongols.
Yes. In 1219, Genghis Khan and the Mongols arrived. And unlike the Turks, the Mongols were non-Muslim conquerors. When they destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and sacked Baghdad in 1258, it triggered a profound theological and political crisis.
Because it broke their worldview.
Entirely. Classical Islamic political thought presumed that the borders of the Muslim world would continually expand. There was simply no ideological framework for losing the historic heartlands of Iran and Iraq to non-believers.
But the narrative corrects itself eventually, right? Because the Mongols in the Middle East eventually convert to Islam by 1295. And even before them, the Seljuks actually became massive champions of the faith. They essentially rescued Sunni orthodoxy, didn't they?
They did, yeah. Prior to the Seljuk invasions, much of the Middle East was actually governed by Shiite dynasties, like the Fatimids in Egypt and the Buyids in Iran.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and these groups, patronized Shiite scholarship, and held huge political leverage over the Sunni caliph. But when the Seljuks arrived, they fiercely championed hardline Sunni orthodoxy. They funded new theological schools, they restored Sunni political supremacy across the region. So, for all the chaos of the invasions, the steppe nomads actually secured the long-term fortunes of Sunni Islam.
Okay, let's pivot a bit here. Because the steppe nomads sweeping across the land with composite bows is really only half the story.
Right.
Because if you look at a map, a composite bow is devastating on the open plains of Central Asia, but it is entirely useless if you're trying to conquer the dense, humid rainforests of Sumatra, or if you're navigating the monsoon coasts of India. Cavalry charges don't really work in the jungle.
No, they certainly do not.
So if military force can't push Islam into Southeast Asia, what does?
Well, geography dictates the method. Moving from the grassy steppes to the maritime highways of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, we see a completely different, totally decentralized mechanism of expansion.
Which was?
Here, Islam spread through the merchant and the mystic. Arab, Persian, and Indian traders, alongside Sufi mystical orders known as tariqas, drove this amazing grassroots civilian movement.
Which requires us to look at the economic incentives, I think. If there is no imperial army forcing a local population to convert, my initial guess is that it has to be economic pressure. Did these wealthy merchants essentially just buy their way into local power structures?
It was more systemic than just outright bribery. What Muslim merchants brought with them was an international commercial ecumen, basically a universally shared cultural and economic zone.
Okay, so it's a network.
Exactly. To understand this, imagine you are a local ruler of a river port in Java in the 13th century. Muslim traders have been sailing these monsoon routes for generations. They establish merchant quarters in your city. If you convert to Islam, you aren't just adopting a new theology.
What are you adopting?
You are plugging your city into a massive, standardized, free trade network.
Ah, because suddenly you're operating under Islamic law.
Exactly the key mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Islamic law, or Sharia, provided a highly developed, standardized legal framework for credit, partnerships, dispute resolution.
So there's a baseline of trust.
Right. If you adopt this system, a trader arriving from Morocco or Yemen trusts that your courts enforce contracts in a way they understand. Your local economy becomes instantly more attractive, less risky, and far more lucrative for international trade. Plus, you can secure valuable marriage alliances with these wealthy merchant families.
It's the ultimate networking move. You're adopting a global operating system, essentially. And they established a deep presence incredibly early on, didn't they?
Very early. By the 8th century, Arab and Persian Muslim traders in Canton, China were numerous enough to actually stage a brief revolt in 758.
Wow. Which brings us back to Admiral Zhenghe in the 15th century. I mean, Islam had woven itself into the fabric of Asian maritime trade so thoroughly that the Ming Dynasty's greatest explorer was a Muslim.
Exactly.
But this peaceful, merchant-driven expansion eventually hits a wall in the 16th century, right? When European naval power enters the chat.
Specifically the Portuguese. When they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean, their strategy was to violently monopolize the spice trade.
Huh?
They specifically targeted the entrenched Muslim networks, the Arab, Gujarati, South Indian, and Malay traders who had dominated these pepper and spice routes for centuries.
I imagine the goal was to just crush them and take the profits, but that strategy severely backfires, doesn't it?
It really does. The aggressive Portuguese tactics actually provoked a high point of Islamic political solidarity in maritime Asia. Rather than folding, local powers rallied together.
Like an alliance.
Yeah. For example, the Sultanate of Asia in northern Sumatra reached out across the globe, sending envoys all the way to the Ottoman court in Istanbul in the 1560s.
That is a massive distance.
Right. They were pleading for military assistance and cannons to fight the Portuguese. The Ottomans provided some technical support, but more importantly, the idea of a unified global counter-crusade in the name of Islam became a very powerful unifying force across the Indian Ocean.
Okay, so we have this religion spreading into Asia through commercial networks and defensive alliances. But because it's arriving via merchants and mystics rather than state conquerors, it encounters a religious landscape wildly different from the Middle East. And the friction between these cultures creates something entirely new.
It is a profound cultural collision. In the Middle East and the Mediterranean, Islam developed in close proximity to Judaism and Christianity.
The other Abrahamic faiths.
Right. And they all share a heavy focus on scriptural orthodoxy, rigid doctrine, drawing sharp theological boundaries. But as Islam moved east, it interacted with Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, indigenous animism.
The text highlights an observation by the 11th century scholar al-Biruni that I found incredibly revealing. He studied these Indic cultures and noted that they rarely, if ever, fought physical wars over theology.
Yes.
Like, they might hold intense verbal debates, but the idea of staking your life or property on a religious controversy was totally alien to them. They operated on a foundational pluralism, the assumption that ultimate reality is infinite and can therefore take many outward forms.
That mindset is perfectly captured in another historical anecdote from the text involving a 17th century Thai king.
Oh, this is a great story.
His court received a Persian embassy urging him to convert to Shiite Islam, which was quickly followed by a French embassy demanding he become a Catholic Christian.
Poor guy.
Right. He politely rejected both. But his reasoning was fascinating. He expressed genuine surprise that the creator god would require all creatures to approach him through the exact same rituals. He argued that since the divine made the natural world so incredibly diverse, we should assume the divine actually takes pleasure in being honored by a diverse array of human rituals.
That is a beautiful, deeply pluralistic way to view religion. But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Go for it.
Islam has a very well-defined, strictly monotheistic, legal and theological framework. How does it survive being blended with Javanese animism or Hindu practices without completely losing its core identity? If you mix those things together, doesn't the original religion just break down?
That is exactly the tension at the heart of this era. The survival and adaptation of Islam in these regions worked primarily because there was no state apparatus to enforce rigid orthodoxy.
No state control.
Right. Non-Muslim rulers, whether they were Thai Buddhists or Chinese Confucians, had no interest in, or really no legitimacy to act as theological inquisitors, ensuring their Muslim subjects were practicing the faith exactly as it was practiced back in Baghdad.
So without an inquisitor knocking on your door, people just start synthesizing. But how did the theology actually mesh on the ground?
The primary bridge was Sufism. The Sufi mystics, organized into those fraternities known as tariqas, they were the ones translating Arabic texts into local languages like Malay and Javanese.
And their focus is a bit different, right?
Very different. Unlike the strict legal scholars, Sufis focused heavily on the inner, experiential reality of the divine. They emphasized the dissolution of the ego and the mystical unity of all creation.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that specific theological framing resonated deeply with existing Asian philosophies of non-duality, the Hindu and Buddhist concepts of shedding the self to merge with the universe.
So they basically found the overlapping philosophical Venn diagram.
They did. We see incredible works of synthesis result from this. In 17th century Java, King Sultan Agung of Mataram achieved a really unique fusion of old Hindu-Buddhist mystical ideas, local animist practices, and Islamic externals.
You see it in the architecture too, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
Early mosques in China and Java, they didn't have domes. They looked like pre-Islamic sacred sites with pagoda-like minarets. Older sacred tombs were gradually Islamized by the presence of revered Sufi saints, and they were transformed into new centers of Islamic pilgrimage.
Okay, so if we take a step back and look at the map now, we have a wildly diverse Islamic world. It stretches from the Balkans in Europe, across the Turkish steppes, all the way to Javanese mystics in the Pacific. It encompasses Arab spice merchants, tribal cavalry archers, and kings practicing synthesized theology. So what does this all mean for the broader culture? Like, what was the administrative glue holding these major power centers together?
The surprising answer to that question is Persian culture.
Which feels entirely counterintuitive for talking about an Arab-born religion and Turkish conquerors.
It really does. Until you look at the mechanics of state building. Going back to those nomadic conquerors, the Seljuks and the Mongols, they realized very quickly that they couldn't run a complex agricultural empire from the back of a horse.
Right.
They needed tax collectors, they needed record keepers, diplomats, administrators, and the people who had been doing that in the region for centuries were the Persians.
So the nomads essentially outsourced the entire bureaucracy to the Persians.
Yes. And because the bureaucracy ran on Persian, Persian became the lingua franca of the Eastern Islamic world. It evolved beyond just administration. It became the language of literature, poetry, history, and civilized discourse across a vast geographic range.
Just everywhere.
Everywhere. To put that dominance in perspective, centuries later, the British East India Company actually required its young British recruits to learn Persian so they could navigate the legal and administrative systems of India.
Wait, British officers in the 19th century learning Persian to govern Indians?
Yeah.
That really hammers home the idea that Persian was the English of the early modern Islamic world. It's the ultimate in networking language.
Really was.
The text also mentions that the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, who was proudly Turkish, wrote his diplomatic letters and his poetry in Persian. He's writing to his fierce rival, the Safavid Shah in Iran, and they are basically trash-talking each other in beautifully penned Persian verse before going to war.
It's amazing. It perfectly illustrates the cultural hegemony of the Persianate world. And this specific era birthed what historians classify as the three great gunpowder empires. The Ottomans in the West, the Safavids in Iran, and the Moguls in India.
And this is where the timeline shifts from quick, volatile, nomadic conquests to massive, stable states that last for centuries.
Because the introduction of gunpowder technology fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance of power. We talked earlier about the unstoppable supremacy of the steppe cavalry archer with his composite bow.
Right, the unstoppable force.
Well, that supremacy finally met a technological wall, which is often pinpointed at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514.
This was the major clash between the Ottomans and the Safavids.
Correct. During that battle, the Ottoman Janissary infantry, who were armed with early muskets, took shelter behind a wagon logger.
A wagon logger, meaning they literally chained their heavy wooden supply carts together to create a mobile fortress on the battlefield, right?
Precisely. They chained their carts and their heavy artillery cannons together, creating an impassable continuous wall of firepower. When the vaunted Safavid cavalry charged, they were shredded. The cannons effectively stopped the mounted archer dead in his tracks.
Wow.
But here is the deeper mechanism at play. Fielding a standing infantry equipped with muskets and casting massive bronze cannons that requires immense wealth, foundries, and huge supply lines.
It requires a massive tax base.
Exactly. The efficient use of gunpowder meant that only wealthy, highly bureaucratic, sedentary states could afford to compete militarily. The era of a charismatic nomadic chieftain throwing together a horde on horseback and conquering the world, that was definitively over.
So the center of gravity in the Islamic world completely shifts away from the Arab heartlands. It moves to this Persian-speaking, gunpowder-wielding, imperial heavyweight division.
Which raises an important question regarding our original myth. Why did European historians ever view this era as a decline? The historian Albert Harani once asked Philip Hitti, the author of famous History of the Arabs, why his seminal book contained almost nothing on the period after the Ottoman conquests.
And what did he say?
Hitti replied, "There was no Arab history then."
There was no Arab history then. Wow. So if the historian is only using an Arab lens, the radar just goes blank for half a millennium, and they misinterpret a shift in power as a total civilizational collapse.
That was the fatal flaw in the historiography. As the scholar Marshall Hodgson pointed out, if you look at the wider Persianate world, the 16th and 17th centuries were actually the absolute apogee of Islamic imperial power. You had three massive, culturally brilliant empires dominating a massive portion of the globe. By the year 1500, the idea of an Islamic decline was a complete historical fiction.
Let's bring this all together. We started with a mission to bust the persistent myth that Islamic history is just a glorious Arab first season, followed by centuries of depressing decline. And looking at the evidence from Morgan and Reid, we can safely say that narrative is entirely broken. From the 11th to the 18th centuries, Islam transformed into a truly global, incredibly pluralistic religion. It expanded not just by the sword, but through the physics of the composite bow, the legal trust of Arab spice merchants, the philosophical translations of Sufi mystics, and the vast bureaucracies of Persian-speaking gunpowder empires. It is a wildly dynamic era.
It truly is. And I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder today. In Western education, we are trained to view the period from the 11th to the 18th centuries as the Middle Ages, a transitional, often dark waiting room sandwiched between the glorious classical era of Rome and the modern Enlightenment.
The Dark Ages.
Right. But for the vast majority of Muslims alive today, who live in Asian nations like Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, this era is not a middle at all. It is their foundational age. It is the era when their ancestors encountered the faith and built their distinct, vibrant Islamic cultures.
That is so true. Imagine viewing history through a lens where the most important centuries of your civilization are just dismissed by others as a dark age. It makes you wonder how much of world history we are completely misinterpreting, simply because we're judging the epic global spin-offs by the narrow rules of Season 1. A massive thank you for joining us on this historical journey today. Keep questioning the map, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.